Hello, my name is David Billings, and I would like to talk with you about how interpersonal communication is an important factor in building healthy relationships. Once we become accurate about our awareness of certain communicational needs and the resources available to create healthier relationships, we could discuss defining enlarging the conversation and how, as communicators, we can influence enlarging that conversation within my own life and yours. During the process, there is an issue that keeps coming up called potential barriers. These particular barriers can be corrected, which many times consists of removing any external or internal noise pollution. Finally, I will discuss about having an action plan that will soar my communicational levels to more of a positive reality. Next slide. Understanding a message behind a message and using level 1 listening is a true dialogue that will become beneficial for the talker and listener. This is done for the purpose of the other party and not of our own interpretation, but to give a more accurate relationship built through positive communication. Next slide. My master goal is to listen better, and how doing that will work for me. The way we listen and respond to others will strongly influence others and the way they respond back. I do not want to be critical or judgmental, and would love to listen to any nonverbal messages. This form of empathetic listening helps me at times ask certain questions and find areas of interest with awareness of any biases that would hinder any possible and positive judgments of the speaker. Next slide. When I find areas in conversations that help me to adopt positive attitudes about certain topics, my knowledge expands. Taking initiatives in figuring out hidden messages and finding out what the talker may know helps my communication become more equal within the relationship. Working at the listening concept focuses on the speaker's ideas and making meaningful questions which will help my thought speed. The entire listening concept will take time and practice, but with an open mind we can understand that nonverbal and verbal communication barriers to a point where we can evaluate and be critical of its content and not the talker's way of delivering it. Next slide. When I interrupt in conversation, it usually is at a level 2 or 3 listening, which is not considering the talker's needs. It will be important for me to listen and learn and paraphrase while trying to lower my internal speaking processes. It would be wise for me to gently interrupt for clarity and feedback. These areas within communication will hopefully sway many of the conversations on a more leveling field. Next slide. It would be also wise for me to learn the hidden messages within the conversations I may be in to enlarge the conversation. Dealing with hurtful messages will be a task for me to handle, but it must be handled to enlarge the conversation. Next slide. After taking the assessment Uniquely You, it was discovered that I have an ISC profile, or behavioral blend, that states that I am gifted with people skills. Impressing the crowd by the way I speak, I look, or I act will always make others feel like I am their best friend. This assessment showed that I am actively and passively outgoing and reserved. I am liked when I share my thoughts on tasks and problems, but when I share opinions, individuals get quickly turned off. Next slide. The negative side to my blend is that I could be negative or critical, where I do not have to be in charge, but where I would love to share my thoughts to those in leadership positions, especially in the areas of expenses or energy. Next slide. As I enlarge the conversation, I should be mindful that judging, avoiding bitterness, and stepping out of my comfort zone, that I can understand myself better my personality, and become productive within my interpersonal communication. Next slide. I have noticed that I tend to think the one who talks has the most power. This concept actually leads to negative attitudes towards listening, such as developing biases and negative barriers of mine, which has become self-defeating. Determining my conversations to be boring, complex, and at times unimportant. The emotions I develop at times become a barrier within my relationships, which is hurting my communication. These barriers can range from external barriers, internal barriers, and even semantic barriers. Next slide. Dealing with these barriers, empathetic listening must transpire so I can recognize each barrier for each conversation. The gift of effectiveness and becoming interested to the talker's needs helps me listen better so that I could use short manner expressions in acknowledgement and invitations for the door openers and potential barrier breakers. Next slide. Internal and external noise pollution are the barriers in our lives that hold back efficient communication. Earlier I discussed some internal noise pollution, but external noise pollution can be those who talk too loud, one's appearance, or even clock watching. These barriers can be overcome by understanding nexting, using the less unwise wording, or just by understanding the other person. Next slide. I should focus on others, their thoughts and feelings while quieting my own internal commentary. These steps will help put myself in a position to give my full attention to the speaker and any specific messages they are relaying. This may include verbal and nonverbal messages, their thoughts and ideas, and at times their body language. This is a great time I could ask clarifying questions to highlight the interest on what may be being said. Next slide. It is important to develop an action plan that will find ways to help us communicate more efficiently with a precision that will grow interpersonal areas. This ultimately will help us connect to others. Next slide. My personal action plan will consist of not being critical or judgmental, but listening more at a level 1. Encouraging others to solve their own problems without interrupting will always be a task, but beneficial. Then when I can accomplish this, questions can be timed, paraphrasing content can be implemented, and the rescuer role can be avoided. Next slide. The other part of my action plan is to be aware of any nonverbal behavior so I can interrupt what is conveyed, while adding dimension to the situation being spoken. Leveling postures, cue words, positive movements, and knowing my facial expressions will help the empathetic listening style that I would like to have built on positive relationships between myself and others. Next slide. Many times I am not aware of my listening habits, and it should be obvious by our conversations to get to know the other person in our conversations, thus securing understanding, aid retention and attention, and encouraging feedback to the listener. Next slide. It is important to make our objectives clear in our own minds so that a positive communication change can be built, because words and ideas get fuzzy or confusing. Next slide. I have a talker's action plan as well that will help me gain favorability in understanding nonverbal behaviors, which will consist in gathering certain cues and one's internal state. This implementation will help myself look at others' stress levels and their criticism. Next slide. The action plan I have put in place will help me gain an empathetic listening style, so trust and confidence can be built, and helping the process of retaining the information found in the conversations. This helps in associating new ideas, those familiar with the listener. Next slide. In closing, interpersonal communication is important within many areas of communicating, such as identity, building, and even in building relationships. Enlarging the conversation and its definition will set us on a path to better listening styles. To do this style of listening, we must have a master goal that will enlarge the conversation, thus minimizing interruption, understanding our own personal behavior blends, and staying positive within the ideas, messages, and empathetic listening we all would want in our conversations. When we think as such, barriers can be broken and more formulated discussions can be held between those communicating. Thank you, and God bless.